Welcome to West Film. We bring you the best movie recaps, reviews, ending explained videos, and hidden details from your favorite films. If you love great movies, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new upload. Now grab some popcorn, and let's jump into today's movie. This connection worked because both actors brought total sincerity to their roles, and that authenticity is visible in every scene they share. The film itself is based on the novel of the same name by A.J. Quinnell. Although Tony Scott's version wasn't the first adaptation, an earlier one had already been made in 1987, and his take on the story brought a far more emotionally driven sensibility while reworking several elements along the way. Rather than leaning on suspense, the 2004 film puts its emphasis squarely on redemption and personal transformation, and that emotional focus is a big part of why so many viewers regard it as the definitive version of the story. Financially, the movie did well, earning roughly $130 million worldwide against an estimated $70 million budget. Solid numbers, but the film's real legacy took shape later, through home video, cable television, and streaming. Many younger viewers discovered Man on Fire years after its theatrical run, and its reputation has kept growing with each new generation. One of those films that seems to gain more admirers with time rather than fewer. Perhaps the film's most impressive achievement in its opening stretch is how thoroughly it earns the audience's emotional investment before it ever leans on major action. That's a hard balance to strike, since so many revenge thrillers rush toward violence as fast as possible. Man on Fire understands that patience pays off with a stronger emotional payoff, taking the time to build believable relationships, damaged personalities, and real emotional stakes. Because of that groundwork, everything that happens later carries far more weight, which is one of the biggest reasons the film still ranks among the finest revenge dramas of the modern era. One of the smartest choices the film makes is never trying to sell John Creasy as a conventional hero. Action movies typically introduce their leads as physically unstoppable, sharp-minded, and fully in control. Creasy is close to the opposite. Long before he has to face outside danger, he's already fighting an internal battle that seems impossible to win. Carrying years of guilt, exhaustion, and self-doubt, the film never rushes past those feelings just to get to the action, and that patience gives the character far more depth than the genre usually offers. Brian Helgeland's screenplay deserves real praise for understanding that emotional healing isn't simple. Rather than handing Creasy one inspiring conversation that flips a switch in his outlook, the script lets that transformation unfold gradually. Small moments of trust, ordinary conversations, shared humor, quiet companionship is slowly changing how he sees himself. It's a subtle process, which is exactly why it feels believable. Real recovery rarely happens all at once, and the screenplay honors that truth by making every small step forward feel earned rather than engineered. Denzel Washington deserves special credit for the patience he brings to this emotional arc. He never pushes the audience toward sympathy through big speeches or emotional breakdowns. Instead, his performance runs on small details: a hesitant smile, a longer pause before speaking, a slight shift in posture that often say more than pages of dialogue could. Washington trusts viewers to notice these shifts on their own, and that confidence produces one of the most mature performances of his career, reaffirming why he's considered one of the finest actors of his generation. Dakota Fanning matches that honesty with a performance that feels genuinely real. Her character could easily have become a simple device to motivate the lead, but Fanning gives her a full personality: intelligent, curious, energetic, and surprisingly mature for her age without ever sounding unnatural. The relationship between Creasy and Peta works because both actors treat it with complete sincerity. Neither performance feels exaggerated, and their bond develops through ordinary conversations that gradually become meaningful. Those quiet moments end up being the emotional heart of the entire film. Tony Scott's direction deserves even more credit for the confidence behind every creative choice. Rather than copying the visual style of other early 2000s action films, he built something entirely his own. Fast shutter speeds, textured film grain, shifting color palettes, subtitles placed directly inside the frame, rapid editing, unusual camera movement, it all combining into an emotional rhythm rather than a strictly realistic presentation. Some viewers found the style overwhelming at first, but over time it's become one of the defining qualities that makes Man on Fire instantly recognizable. Paul Cameron's cinematography plays an equally important role in supporting that vision. Mexico City is shot with real respect for both its beauty and its complexity. The film never reduces it to a dangerous stereotype, instead presenting a place where energy, culture, wealth, poverty, hope, and fear all exist side by side. That environment constantly reflects the emotional uncertainty surrounding the characters, with crowded streets, busy intersections, towering buildings, and quieter residential areas all contributing to a world that feels authentic rather than built for dramatic effect. Pietro Scaglia's editing is another technical achievement worth singling out. This isn't simply fast-cutting meant to generate excitement. Every transition supports the emotional tone of the scene it's in. Calm moments are allowed to breathe, while tenser stretches grow increasingly fragmented and charged. That shifting rhythm mirrors Creasy's emotional state throughout, treating editing not as an invisible technical process but as another storytelling tool that helps audiences experience the character's psychology rather than just observe events from a distance. Harry Gregson Williams delivers one of his strongest scores here. His music rarely tries to overpower the performances. Instead, it quietly supports the emotional atmosphere while letting silence carry its own weight. Soft piano melodies, subtle orchestral themes, and restrained electronic textures combine to create a soundtrack that feels emotional without tipping into sentimentality. The score knows exactly when to step forward and when to fade back, keeping the performances the primary focus. The sound design follows the same philosophy of restraint rather than making every action sequence louder than the last. The filmmakers carefully balance dialogue, ambient sound, music, and silence, so emotional moments land with just as much force as physical ones. Many viewers remember the film mainly for its action, but a good deal of its emotional impact actually comes from these quieter technical choices working beneath the surface. One interesting production detail is that Tony Scott reportedly fostered a collaborative atmosphere on set, giving actors room to explore emotional beats naturally instead of forcing every scene to match the script word for word. That flexibility helped Washington and Fanning build chemistry that feels spontaneous rather than rehearsed. Washington has spoken about how impressed he was by Fanning's professionalism, noting that she approached scenes with the focus and discipline of a far more experienced performer, and their mutual respect is visible throughout the film. The production also benefited enormously from extensive location shooting in Mexico City. Rather than recreating the environment on studio sets, the filmmakers leaned into real locations wherever possible, giving the movie an authenticity that's hard to fake. Streets, neighborhoods, traffic, architecture, and everyday life all contribute to a world that feels lived in. Production designer Chris Seegers complemented these locations by building environments that blended naturally with the city's existing character, avoiding the polished artificiality that often creeps into big studio productions. Financially, Man on Fire proved that character-driven action films could still draw an audience. Its worldwide gross of around $130 million didn't place it among 2004's biggest blockbusters, but it was a strong showing for an R-rated thriller built on emotional storytelling rather than non-stop spectacle. More importantly, its reputation kept growing through DVD sales, TV broadcasts, and eventually streaming, introducing it to entirely new audiences years later. Maybe the most impressive thing about the film at this point is how effortlessly it combines emotional sincerity with technical ambition. Plenty of movies that experiment visually lose track of character, and plenty of emotionally strong stories play it too safe on the filmmaking side. Man on Fire refuses to choose between the two. Tony Scott delivers bold direction, Denzel Washington gives one of his most memorable performances, and every technical department is pulling toward the same emotional goal. That combination is genuinely hard to pull off, which is exactly why the film still stands out more than 20 years after its release. Part of why Man on Fire has aged so well is that it understands memorable action isn't built on explosions or gunfire alone. Those things can be exciting, sure, but without emotional context they rarely leave a lasting impression. Scott and Hal Jalen clearly understood this from the start. Every major action sequence in the film is tied to Creasy's emotional journey rather than existing purely to entertain. That's why the violence carries real weight instead of feeling like empty spectacle. Audiences aren't just watching exciting scenes unfold, they're watching the choices of a man whose entire outlook on life has been upended. The screenplay also deserves credit for exploring redemption without turning the story sentimental. Redemption is one of the oldest themes in cinema, and it often becomes predictable because writers reach for familiar emotional shortcuts. Man on Fire avoids those cliché copyrights by never suggesting redemption comes easily. Creasy isn't suddenly forgiven for his past, nor does he instantly become a different person. Instead, the script presents redemption as something earned through hard choices, personal sacrifice, and real emotional growth, giving the film a level of depth many action thrillers never attempt. Washington continues to impress because he understands that emotional restraint often lands harder than dramatic expression. Creasy rarely says more than he has to. Instead of explaining his emotions, he carries them quietly, and Washington uses silence almost as effectively as dialogue, letting posture, eye contact, and small shifts in expression communicate his internal struggle. Few actors can say so much with so little, which is part of why this performance remains one of the most respected of his career. Dakota Fanning likewise continues to prove why this role became a defining moment in her early career. She never feels like a child actor reciting memorized lines as she behaves naturally, responding to situations with believable curiosity, intelligence, and emotional honesty. Her chemistry with Washington develops so effortlessly that audiences quickly forget they're watching two performers. They feel like two people whose lives have unexpectedly become deeply connected. That authenticity becomes the emotional foundation of the whole film and is ultimately what makes the story so memorable. Tony Scott's directing style deserves even more appreciation today than it received on release. His visual choices were often criticized at the time for being overly stylized, but many of those same techniques now look innovative rather than distracting. Rapid cuts, shifting color tones, multiple exposure effects, handwritten subtitles, and fragmented visual textures all serve a purpose beyond simply looking different. They reflect Creasy's emotional instability, his fragmented state of mind, and the chaotic world around him. Once you view Scott's visual language through that lens, it becomes much easier to appreciate. Paul Cameron's cinematography supports that vision beautifully. Every location feels authentic because the camera never treats Mexico City as a tourist destination or a generic crime setting. Instead, it captures the city's energy, contrasts, and complexity with real honesty. Busy streets, elegant neighborhoods, crowded intersections, and quieter residential pockets all become important parts of the atmosphere. And rather than separating the characters from their surroundings, the cinematography keeps reminding viewers that the city itself shapes everything happening around them. The production design deserves praise for the same reason. Chris Seegers and his team avoided environments that looked overly polished or cinematic. Homes, offices, schools, restaurants, and streets all feel lived in. That attention to realism strengthens every performance, since the actors are interacting with spaces that resemble real locations rather than carefully arranged movie sets. It's the kind of technical achievement audiences tend to overlook precisely because it feels so natural, yet it quietly reinforces the emotional credibility of the whole story. Scalia's editing remains one of the film's most distinctive technical strengths. Rather than sticking to conventional Hollywood pacing, the cutting constantly adapts to the emotional tone of the moment. The quiet scenes unfold patiently, letting viewers absorb the conversations and performances, while more intense stretches grow visually fragmented. creating a sense of urgency without sacrificing clarity. That emotional rhythm gives the film its unique identity and shows how editing can be a genuine storytelling tool rather than a simple connective process. Harry Gregson Williams's score complements that rhythm perfectly, and one of its greatest strengths is how understated it stays rather than constantly flagging dramatic moments with loud orchestral cues. The music often supports scenes almost invisibly. Softer melodies let emotional conversations breathe, while more intense compositions only arrive when truly necessary. That disciplined approach keeps the score from overwhelming the performances, leaving the emotional connection between characters as the audience's primary focus. The sound design reflects the same balance. The film doesn't lean on constant gunfire or explosive effects to sustain excitement. Silence carries just as much weight as noise. Environmental sounds, traffic, footsteps, distant voices, city ambience quietly reinforce the realism of each location, immersing viewers in the world without calling attention to themselves. Great sound design often works because audiences barely notice it, and that's certainly true here. One especially interesting production detail involves Tony Scott's close collaboration with Denzel Washington. The two had worked together before and shared a strong creative bond built on mutual trust. Scott reportedly encouraged Washington to shape certain emotional beats by instinct rather than sticking rigidly to the script, and that creative freedom produced a performance that feels remarkably natural and emotionally honest. Their partnership would go on to continue on later projects, further proof of how successful the collaboration had become. The film's action choreography deserves appreciation too, since it prioritizes realism over spectacle. Physical confrontations rarely look glamorous or overly choreographed. They feel dangerous, exhausting, and emotionally charged. The stunt team focused on making every movement feel practical and believable rather than exaggerated, and combined with Scott's energetic visual style, these grounded action sequences build real tension without losing credibility. Even viewers who've seen countless action films often note how emotionally different the violence in Man on Fire feels. Audience reception has evolved significantly over the years. Critics were initially divided over the film's experimental visual style, but audiences embraced its emotional storytelling almost immediately. As time passed, many critics revisited the film and recognized that Scott's stylistic choices were closely tied to its emotional themes rather than existing purely for visual effect. Today, Man on Fire is frequently cited as one of the strongest revenge thrillers of the 2000s and remains one of Denzel Washington's most beloved performances. Perhaps the film's greatest achievement is that it never loses sight of its emotional purpose. Beneath every visual experiment, every action sequence, and every dramatic beat lies a story about healing, redemption, sacrifice, and finding meaning after believing life has nothing left to give. That emotional honesty is what keeps setting Man on Fire apart from so many other action films of its era. More than 20 years later, it's remembered not just for what happens, but for how deeply it makes audiences care about the people living through it. One of the qualities that makes the film feel timeless is how much confidence it has in its audience. It never stops to explain every emotion or spell out every motivation through lengthy dialogue. Instead, it trusts viewers to read facial expressions, notice shifts in behavior, and understand emotions that go unspoken. That kind of confidence is surprisingly rare in mainstream action cinema. Many films are constantly telling you how to feel, but Scott lets emotions develop on their own terms, which is why the story feels more personal and rewards repeat viewings. A big part of that success traces back to Brian L. Jalen's screenplay. Even though the film is based on A.J. Quinnell's novel, the adaptation feels remarkably cinematic. L. Jalen understands that movies communicate through images and performance just as much as dialogue, so instead of filling every scene with explanation, he leaves room for silence and observation. The script also avoids turning its central themes into obvious messages. Ideas like forgiveness, purpose, sacrifice, and redemption grow organically through the characters rather than arriving as speeches. And that subtlety makes the emotional impact land harder because viewers reach those conclusions on their own. Washington deserves even more credit here for knowing exactly when to let silence do the work. Plenty of actors would be tempted to play Creasy as more overtly dramatic or emotional. But Washington consistently chooses restraint. His performance is built on control. Every small smile, brief pause, or quiet glance feels meaningful precisely because he never overuses those moments. Watch him closely and you see an actor who understands that genuine emotion often lives in the smallest details rather than the biggest gestures. It's a masterclass in understated acting that continues to impress casual viewers and film enthusiasts alike. Dakota Fanning's contribution becomes even more remarkable considering her age during production. She carries herself with a confidence many adult performers struggle to match, and more importantly, she never seems to be performing for the camera. Her reactions feel spontaneous, her conversations feel natural, and her emotional scenes avoid unnecessary exaggeration. Her bond with Washington works because neither actor tries to force the chemistry. Instead, they build it through patience and authenticity, making it one of the strongest examples of believable on-screen chemistry between an adult and a child performer in modern cinema. Scott's directing deserves renewed appreciation, too, for showing a willingness to take creative risks even after years of commercial success. Plenty of established directors eventually settle into familiar techniques, but Scott kept searching for new visual approaches. In Man on Fire, he experiments with multiple camera formats, high-contrast lighting, rapid editing, layered imagery, handwritten subtitles, and shifting color palettes, and none of it random, since every visual choice reflects the emotional instability surrounding the characters, making the audience feel tension rather than simply observe it. That's part of why the film still looks visually distinct more than 2 decades later. Paul Cameron's cinematography strengthens all of this beautifully. The camera frequently moves with purpose rather than sitting static, creating the sense that the world itself is shifting around the characters. Lighting matters too. A bright daylight often carries emotional warmth, while darker scenes emphasize uncertainty and isolation. Cameron isn't chasing beautiful compositions for their own sake. Every frame supports the story's emotional tone, and that close collaboration between director and cinematographer gives the film an identity that stands apart from most thrillers of its era. Pietro Scaglia's editing remains one of the film's most discussed technical achievements. Some critics argued at the time that the cutting was too aggressive, but looking back, it's easier to see how closely that rhythm matches the character's emotional state. As peaceful moments flow gently, while anxious stretches become visually fragmented, rather than distracting from the story. These choices put viewers inside Creasy's emotional perspective, making the experience feel immersive rather than merely observational. Harry Gregson Williams's score also deserves more recognition than it often gets. Instead of competing with the visuals, the music quietly supports them. Emotional themes build gradually and evolve alongside the characters rather than constantly announcing dramatic beats. The score blends orchestral arrangements with subtle electronic textures for a sound that feels modern while staying emotionally rich, and it's the kind of soundtrack that becomes more impressive on repeat viewings once you notice how carefully it's woven into the storytelling. The production design is another technical strength worth noting. Chris Seegers and his team focused on authenticity over visual polish. Every location feels like somewhere people genuinely live and work. Homes carry personal touches, schools feel active rather than staged, and public spaces retain the natural energy of everyday life. That realism grounds the story emotionally, letting viewers connect with the characters without constantly being reminded they're watching a carefully built Hollywood set. One fascinating behind-the-scenes detail: Tony Scott spent significant time refining the film's visual style during post-production. Color timing, editing rhythms, subtitles, and visual textures were all adjusted with real precision to achieve the emotional atmosphere he envisioned. These weren't last-minute flourishes but carefully planned elements meant to make audiences feel Creasy's psychological state. That dedication to visual storytelling explains why Scott remained one of Hollywood's most respected action directors throughout his career. The casting process deserves attention too. Washington was always the obvious centerpiece, but finding the right actor for the younger role mattered just as much. Dakota Fanning had already impressed audiences in earlier work, but Man on Fire confirmed she had genuinely remarkable dramatic instincts, so her ability to share the screen with one of the industry's greatest actors without ever being overshadowed remains one of the film's quiet achievements. And the casting team deserves real credit for recognizing how essential that chemistry would become. Commercially, the film kept building momentum long after leaving theaters. Its roughly $130 million worldwide theatrical take was respectable, but its lasting popularity came through DVD sales, TV broadcasts, and later streaming. Many people who now count Man on Fire among their favorite films never actually saw it during its original run, if they discovered it years later through recommendations, proof of how powerful word of mouth can be when a film leaves a lasting impression. Maybe the highest compliment you can pay Man on Fire is that it rewards repeat viewings. The first watch naturally centers on emotion and suspense, but every revisit turns up new details in the performances, cinematography, editing, and sound. As small gestures grow more meaningful, visual choices become easier to appreciate, and the themes deepen with familiarity. Very few action films offer that kind of depth, which is why this one has steadily earned classic status among genre fans. It isn't remembered simply for memorable action, it's remembered because every technical and creative element works together to tell an emotionally honest story that keeps connecting with audiences year after year. What really sets Man on Fire apart from so many revenge thrillers is the patience behind its emotional foundation. A lot of films in this genre are eager to reach the action because that's what audiences expect. Scott and Hal Jalem take a different approach. They understand revenge only carries emotional weight once the audience fully grasps what's been lost. Rather than treating emotion as a brief setup before the action starts, the film makes it the center of the entire experience. So every dramatic moment carries weight because viewers already have a genuine connection to the characters. That emotional investment is what turns the movie from a standard thriller into something more memorable. The screenplay also deserves praise for resisting easy moral answers. Creasy isn't presented as a flawless hero, and his actions aren't treated as unquestionably right. The story keeps reminding viewers that violence has consequences no matter who commits it. That moral complexity gives the film more maturity than many action movies of its era. Rather than glorifying violence for its own sake, the script explores what drives someone toward those choices and the emotional cost that follows, letting audiences understand Creasy without necessarily agreeing with every decision he makes. Washington keeps impressing because he never lets the character become larger than life, even in moments that could easily tip into exaggeration. His performance stays grounded in emotion. He plays Creasy as someone driven more by personal conviction than anger, someone who rarely loses emotional control, and that restraint actually makes him more intimidating. Washington understands that confidence doesn't require loud dialogue or big gestures. His calm, measured approach gives the performance real authority while keeping it emotionally believable. One reason his performance works so well is that he's constantly reacting rather than simply delivering lines. Great acting often comes from listening rather than speaking, and that's evident through how his facial expressions shift subtly depending on who he's talking to, revealing emotions that stay unspoken. Whether he's quiet, thoughtful, uneasy, or determined, every reaction feels truthful, and that attention to emotional detail keeps the audience invested even in scenes with very little dialogue. Dakota Fanning deserves continued recognition for providing exactly the emotional balance the story needs. Her performance sidesteps every common stereotype tied to child characters in action films. If she isn't unrealistically mature, nor is she written as helpless. Instead, she feels like a genuine kid, full of intelligence, curiosity, fear, and optimism, and those qualities make her relationship with Creasy feel authentic rather than manufactured. The trust that gradually builds between them grows through ordinary human interaction rather than dramatic shortcuts, which makes the emotional payoff hit that much harder. Scott's visual direction keeps revealing new strengths on repeat viewings. At first glance his style looks energetic and chaotic, but underneath the surface is remarkable control at every editing decision, camera move, and visual effect serves the story's emotional rhythm. The shifting color palettes often track changes in mood, while the camera grows calmer during intimate moments and more aggressive as emotional pressure builds. Scott wasn't experimenting just to stand out. His choices constantly reinforce what the characters are feeling internally. Paul Cameron's cinematography deserves equal credit for capturing both intimacy and scale with real consistency. Close-ups let audiences study the performances in detail, while wider shots remind viewers of the larger world around the characters. Mexico City itself becomes almost another character in the film, contributing to the overall atmosphere through its architecture, crowded streets, neighborhoods, and everyday activity, a sense of place that gives the story a level of realism many studio productions struggle to achieve. The production design quietly reinforces that same realism. Segers and his team avoided environments that felt overly polished or cinematic. Homes, schools, offices, and public spaces all appear lived in, containing the small imperfections that make real places believable. These details may not grab attention on their own, but they help build an immersive world where audiences quickly forget they're watching a carefully constructed production. Great production design often succeeds by staying invisible, and that's certainly true here. Harry Gregson Williams's score continues to show real emotional intelligence. Instead of dominating scenes with orchestral power, the music often stays understated, letting the performances carry the emotional load. Gentle themes accompany quieter, reflective moments, while more dramatic cues appear only when necessary, a careful balance that keeps emotional scenes from feeling manipulated. Rather than telling viewers how to feel, the score simply supports emotions that are already present in the performances. The sound design follows a similar philosophy. Environmental sound plays a big role in making every location feel authentic. Conversations stay clear without unnecessary background noise crowding them out, while action sequences keep their impact without becoming exhausting. That careful audio balance reflects the overall discipline running through the production. Every technical department seems committed to serving the story rather than drawing attention to itself. One interesting behind-the-scenes fact: Tony Scott was known for shooting enormous amounts of footage from multiple angles, which gave editor Pietro Scalia tremendous flexibility in post-production to shape scenes with real precision. That approach demanded far more work in the editing room, but it also helped create the distinctive visual rhythm that became one of the film's defining traits. Scott believed a lot of the movie's emotional energy would ultimately come together in editing, and the finished film clearly reflects that philosophy. The production also benefited from strong collaboration across departments: costume design, makeup, cinematography, editing, and music all support the same emotional tone rather than competing for attention. Creasy's appearance evolves naturally alongside his emotional journey, while the visual atmosphere consistently reflects the story's psychological state. These details might seem small individually, but together they create a remarkably cohesive experience. Audience appreciation for Man on Fire has only grown stronger with time. Plenty of films enjoy a strong theatrical run before slowly fading from memory, but this one took the opposite path. Critics were initially split over Scott's bold stylistic approach, but audiences embraced the emotional storytelling from the start, and as years passed, more reviewers revisited the film and acknowledged that many of its visual choices were far more purposeful than they'd first seemed. Today, it's widely regarded as one of the finest collaborations between Tony Scott and Denzel Washington. Ultimately, the greatest strength of Man on Fire lies in its emotional honesty. It never pretends redemption is easy or that emotional pain simply disappears. It presents deeply flawed people searching for purpose in a complicated world, and every technical achievement, from the cinematography and editing to the music and performances, exists to support that central idea. That's why the movie keeps connecting with viewers decades later, long after the action itself is over. It's the emotional journey that stays with people, proof that the strongest revenge stories are rarely just about revenge. Another reason Man on Fire continues earning appreciation is that it never treats its audience as though they only care about action. Plenty of Hollywood thrillers assume viewers need a big set piece every few minutes to stay engaged. But this film proves otherwise. Some of its strongest moments involve nothing more than two characters talking, or sitting together in silence. Those quieter scenes build trust, reveal personality, and create emotional depth, so that by the time the story reaches its most intense stretches, the audience already understands exactly who these people are and why their choices matter. That careful pacing is one of the film's greatest strengths. Helge Allen's writing also deserves recognition for how naturally it balances realism with cinematic storytelling. The script doesn't lean on long speeches to explain every emotion or theme. It trusts viewers to interpret what they're seeing. The characters behave like real people rather than vehicles for exposition, and conversations feel casual, imperfect, and believable, which strengthens the emotional relationships considerably. Even as the story grows more dramatic, it never fully loses that sense of authenticity, a difficult balance to strike, and one reason the screenplay still feels fresh today. Washington once again proves why he remains one of the most respected actors working today. His performance isn't built on dramatic outbursts or flashy emotional beats. It's defined by consistency. From beginning to end, Creasy feels like the same person, gradually changing through experience rather than suddenly becoming someone else. Washington lets those changes happen slowly, which makes them believable, and his control over tone is remarkable. Whether a scene calls for a quiet vulnerability or steady confidence, he never overplays the emotion. That restraint gives the performance tremendous credibility. One especially impressive part of Washington's acting is how well he conveys internal conflict. Creasy is a man constantly wrestling with his own past, and those struggles stay visible throughout the film. Even in scenes with very little dialogue, viewers can sense the weight he's carrying through subtle physical performance rather than obvious emotional display. His posture, eye contact, breathing, and timing all add up to a character who feels deeply human, and it's the kind of acting that tends to grow more impressive on repeat viewings, since so much is happening beneath the surface. Dakota Fanning continues to match that emotional honesty with real maturity. Her performance never feels rehearsed or overly polished as she reacts to situations with curiosity, kindness, and intelligence that feel entirely believable for her character. Plenty of child performances lean on exaggerated expressions or overly emotional dialogue, but Fanning avoids those traps entirely, creating a character audiences genuinely care about because she simply feels real. Her chemistry with Washington remains one of the film's defining strengths and gives everything else its emotional foundation. Scott's direction also deserves continued praise for staying emotionally focused despite his visually ambitious style. Directors who experiment heavily with editing, color grading, and camera movement sometimes risk distracting audiences from the story. Scott avoids that trap because every stylistic decision serves the characters. His visual language reflects emotional states rather than existing purely for artistic effect. The change in textures, fragmented editing, shifting colors, and energetic camera work all help audiences experience the story emotionally rather than merely watch it unfold. That balance between style and substance has become one of the film's defining strengths. Paul Cameron's cinematography continues to support that vision with real precision. Every frame feels thoughtfully composed without looking artificial. Close-ups let subtle performances shine, while wider shots establish the scale and atmosphere of Mexico City, which remains one of the film's most important visual elements. Rather than reducing it to a simple setting, Cameron captures its complexity with honesty and respect. Wealth and poverty, beauty and danger, common chaos, all existing side by side, strengthening the story's emotional realism. The production design deserves similar recognition for constantly reinforcing authenticity. Every location feels occupied by real people rather than dressed for a film crew. Small details inside homes, offices, schools, and public spaces build an atmosphere audiences instinctively accept as genuine. These design choices rarely become the focus of discussion, but they quietly support every performance by creating believable surroundings. Strong production design rarely calls attention to itself, and that's exactly what makes it work here. Harry Gregson Williams once again shows exceptional musical discipline. His score never competes with the actors or tries to manufacture emotion artificially. It quietly enhances scenes that already carry emotional weight, through delicate piano passages, restrained orchestral arrangements, and carefully placed electronic textures that feel both intimate and cinematic. The soundtrack stays memorable precisely because it understands when silence can be more powerful than music, a level of restraint that's surprisingly rare in modern action cinema. The sound design follows the same philosophy. Every environment feels alive thanks to carefully layered background sound that never overwhelms the dialogue. Streets carry their own rhythm, buildings carry natural ambience, and quieter locations feel appropriately isolated. During action scenes, sound effects stay impactful without becoming excessively loud or unrealistic, and that careful balance contributes enormously to the film's immersive quality, even if audiences don't consciously register the craft behind it. One particularly interesting production fact: Tony Scott and editor Pietro Scalia reportedly spent an enormous amount of time refining the film's pacing after principal photography wrapped. Scott believed emotional rhythm mattered just as much as narrative structure, so scenes were carefully adjusted until every transition supported the character's psychological journey. That attention to detail helps explain why the film flows so naturally despite its bold visual experimentation, and nothing feels random, because every creative decision was shaped with emotional purpose. The collaboration across departments deserves recognition too. Costume design subtly reflects character changes without becoming overly symbolic. Makeup stays realistic throughout, avoiding unnecessary glamour. Lighting shifts naturally with mood rather than following an obvious visual formula. Together, these departments create a cohesive experience where every element supports the same emotional vision, of the kind of unified filmmaking audiences may not consciously notice but instinctively respond to. The film's legacy has only kept growing with time. Its theatrical run was solid, but Man on Fire truly became a classic through home entertainment and streaming, with word-of-mouth recommendations introducing it to countless viewers who missed it the first time around. Many now consider it one of Denzel Washington's finest performances and one of Tony Scott's greatest directorial achievements. It regularly appears on lists of the best revenge films ever made, proof that genuine emotional storytelling often outlasts temporary box office success. Looking back today, it's easy to see why Man on Fire has remained so influential. It shows that action movies don't have to choose between excitement and emotional depth. They can deliver both when every creative department is pulling in the same direction. Strong writing, unforgettable performances, confident direction, beautiful cinematography, intelligent editing, thoughtful music, and authentic production design all combined into something far more meaningful than a typical revenge thriller. Which is why audiences keep discovering this film year after year, and why it still feels just as powerful now as it did in theaters. One aspect of Man on Fire that often goes unnoticed is how carefully it avoids becoming predictable. Even though it follows a familiar genre structure, most revenge thrillers lean on constant surprises or shocking twists to hold attention. This film takes a different path. Rather than asking what happens next, it quietly poses a more emotional question: how will these experiences change the people involved? That subtle shift changes the whole viewing experience, turning the story from plot mechanics into emotional consequence and letting audiences connect with the characters on a deeper level. Hal Jalen's screenplay deserves additional praise for consistently valuing character over convenience. At every major emotional turning point, the writing asks what feels true for the characters rather than what would create the biggest spectacle, and that discipline keeps the film grounded even as circumstances intensify. Plenty of action films sacrifice believable behavior in favor of dramatic moments, But Man on Fire rarely falls into that trap. Every important decision feels like something these characters would genuinely make, based on everything the audience already knows about them. Washington's performance keeps revealing new layers on every revisit. His portrayal of Creasy isn't just about pain or quiet determination. There's an underlying exhaustion that never fully disappears. Even in moments when a character seems stronger or more confident, Washington subtly reminds viewers that Creasy is still carrying years of emotional damage. That consistency makes the performance believable, because real emotional scars rarely vanish completely, or they simply become easier to manage. And Washington communicates that idea with real subtlety. Another impressive quality of his acting is his ability to create tension through stillness. Many action stars rely on physical movement or loud dialogue to command a scene. But Washington often achieves the opposite effect. He is most compelling when he stays calm, and his quiet confidence naturally draws attention because audiences sense the intensity underneath. That restrained style gives the character a presence that feels very different from the typical Hollywood action hero. Dakota Fanning keeps pace with Washington scene for scene without ever feeling overshadowed. Given her age during production, her emotional intelligence is genuinely astonishing, as she understands exactly how much emotion each moment calls for and never pushes past it. Her performance feels effortless because she avoids obvious acting techniques, instead behaving naturally and letting audiences believe in the character rather than admire the performance itself. One of the highest compliments any actor can receive, at any age. Scott's direction also deserves recognition for its emotional discipline. Though his visual style is energetic and instantly recognizable, he never lets technique overshadow the story. Every creative choice serves the emotional journey rather than existing for visual impact alone. His fragmented editing, layered imagery, shifting color tones, and dynamic camera movement all reinforce the character's psychological state. Those choices might look bold on the surface, but underneath is a carefully controlled emotional structure that keeps the audience connected from start to finish. Paul Cameron's cinematography reinforces that structure through thoughtful composition and lighting. Close-ups invite viewers to study the subtler performances, while wider frames remind them of the larger world around the characters. Mexico City's visual identity remains one of the film's strongest, as it's never a generic backdrop for action, but a living, breathing environment full of energy, beauty, tension, and unpredictability, which adds real depth to the overall atmosphere. Production designer Chris Seegers deserves continued praise for creating realistic environments that quietly support the story. Every location reflects the personality and lifestyle of the people who occupy it. Nothing looks overly polished or artificially dramatic. Schools feel active, homes contain believable details, offices feel functional, and public spaces carry the natural imperfections of everyday life. These elements might not draw immediate attention, but they help create a world audiences instinctively accept as genuine. Harry Gregson Williams's score remains one of the film's most underrated achievements. Rather than layering overwhelming orchestral music onto every emotional beat, he often opts for simplicity and gentle piano melodies, restrained strings, and subtle electronic textures that quietly support the performances instead of competing with them. That balance lets emotions build naturally rather than feel manipulated. It's a soundtrack built on patience rather than volume, matching the overall tone of the film perfectly. The sound design follows that same approach. Every location carries its own atmosphere through carefully layered environmental sound. The conversations stay clear without unnatural studio polish, while quieter scenes benefit from subtle background ambience that boosts realism. During action sequences, sound effects keep their power without becoming overwhelming, demonstrating how every technical department worked toward the same emotional goal rather than chasing spectacle for its own sake. One particularly interesting behind-the-scenes fact involves Scott's editing philosophy. He believed emotion should always drive pacing rather than strict narrative rules. So editor Pietro Scalia reportedly tried numerous versions of individual scenes before settling on rhythms that best captured the characters' emotional states. That took enormous patience during post-production but ultimately gave the film its distinctive flow. One of the reasons Man on Fire feels so emotionally immersive despite its unconventional editing style. Another fascinating production detail concerns the collaboration between Washington and Scott. Having already built mutual trust through earlier work together, the two shared an understanding that gave Washington real freedom in shaping his character's emotional responses. Scott valued instinctive performances and encouraged actors to prioritize authenticity over technical perfection, and that collaborative environment helped produce work that still feels remarkably natural more than 20 years later. Audience appreciation has kept growing because the film rewards emotional maturity. Younger viewers may remember the action first, but many people who revisit it later in life find entirely different qualities standing out. Themes of regret, personal responsibility, forgiveness, sacrifice, and finding purpose grow more meaningful with age, which is one reason Man on Fire has held on to such a loyal following across generations and offers something different depending on where viewers are in their own lives. Ultimately, the film's lasting success comes from its refusal to simplify complicated emotions. It never pretends healing is easy, that justice is uncomplicated, or that redemption happens overnight. It presents flawed people trying to find meaning in extremely difficult circumstances, and every department, from the screenplay and performances to the cinematography, editing, music, and production design, supports that idea with remarkable consistency. More than 2 decades after its release, the film keeps proving that emotional honesty outlasts trends, making it one of the most respected and enduring revenge thrillers of modern cinema. One of the film's greatest achievements becomes impossible to ignore. It never loses sight of its emotional identity. Many action thrillers start with strong character work but gradually abandon it once the bigger set pieces arrive. Scott avoids that mistake entirely. Even during the film's most intense stretches, every choice stays connected to emotion rather than spectacle. The action never shows up simply because audiences expect it, but because the story has reached a point where those moments feel emotionally unavoidable. That discipline is one of the biggest reasons the film still stands above so many other revenge thrillers. Hal Jalen's screenplay also deserves admiration for understanding the value of restraint. Rather than overloading the audience with unnecessary twists or constantly redirecting the story, the script stays focused on its central emotional arc. That confidence lets viewers become fully invested in the characters without feeling pulled around by overly complicated plotting. Simplicity, done well, often ends up more powerful than complexity, and Man on Fire is a strong example of that principle. The narrative stays emotionally rich because it never forgets what actually matters. Washington's performance gains even more appreciation viewed against his overall career. He's played charismatic leaders, determined investigators, conflicted heroes, and unforgettable villains, yet John Creasy remains one of his most emotionally layered characters. What makes the performance exceptional is its honesty. Washington never tries to make Creasy more likable than he actually is, accepting his flaws, regrets, and emotional wounds without softening them for the audience. That honesty builds trust between the actor and the viewer, making every emotional beat feel authentic rather than manufactured. One particularly impressive quality of Washington's acting is his ability to balance physical presence with emotional vulnerability. Creasy clearly has strength and experience, but Washington never lets those qualities overshadow the character's fragility. Both exist simultaneously. The audience sees someone capable of extraordinary determination while also recognizing the loneliness and guilt still shaping his decisions. Very few actors manage that balance as naturally as Washington does here, which is why the performance keeps earning praise decades later. Dakota Fanning remains equally deserving of recognition. Her performance succeeds because it feels completely sincere. She never seems to be acting for emotional effect or trying to impress the audience. Every reaction feels spontaneous, every conversation feels believable, and every emotional moment grows naturally out of the relationships around her character. It's easy to see why so many viewers keep bringing up her performance when discussing Man on Fire. She provides the emotional warmth that gives the entire story its heart. Scott's direction grows more impressive with each passing year, largely because of how fearless it feels. He wasn't interested in making a visually ordinary thriller. He embraced techniques that reflect emotion rather than realism. Rapid editing, shifting colors, layered imagery, unusual subtitles, and constantly changing visual rhythms all contribute to an atmosphere unlike almost any other action film of its era. Some critics initially viewed these choices as excessive, but time has been kind to Scott's instincts, and today those same decisions are often celebrated as one of the film's defining strengths. Paul Cameron's cinematography deserves continued praise for maintaining visual consistency despite the film's constantly shifting emotional tone, whether capturing intimate conversations or larger moments of tension. His photography always serves the characters first. Mexico City remains beautifully realized throughout, vibrant, unpredictable, and authentic without ever feeling romanticized or oversimplified. Cameron understands that location can shape mood just as much as lighting or composition, and he uses every part of the environment to reinforce the emotional atmosphere. Pietro Scaglia's editing continues to demonstrate why he's one of the industry's most respected editors. Every cut feels motivated by emotion rather than simply keeping passing. Quiet scenes linger just long enough for performances to resonate, while more intense moments become increasingly fragmented without sacrificing clarity. This emotional rhythm gives the film a unique identity that sets it apart from more conventionally edited thrillers, following a pace tied directly to Creasy's psychological journey rather than any standard formula. Harry Gregson Williams again shows how valuable musical restraint can be. Rather than announcing every emotional beat with dramatic orchestration, he often lets simple melodies carry enormous emotional weight. The score supports rather than dominates the performances, creating intimacy even in larger cinematic moments where many action soundtracks focus mainly on excitement. Gregson Williams consistently prioritizes emotion, giving the music lasting impact and complementing Scott's storytelling style perfectly. The production design deserves another mention for how consistently it reinforces realism. Every environment appears practical, functional, and occupied by real people. Nothing feels artificially designed simply to look impressive on screen. That attention to authenticity strengthens audience immersion, since accepting the environment as real makes viewers naturally more invested in the people living within it. A subtle but genuinely important achievement. One fascinating behind-the-scenes fact involves the close creative relationship between Scott and Washington. By the time they made Man on Fire, the two had built enormous mutual respect, allowing for open creative collaboration throughout production. Scott trusted Washington's instincts completely, often encouraging him to shape emotional moments based on what felt truest for the character. That freedom contributed significantly to the natural, understated quality of Creasy's performance and became one of the finished film's defining strengths. Another important part of the production was the commitment to shooting on real locations wherever possible. Rather than leaning heavily on studio sets, the filmmakers embraced Mexico City's actual streets, neighborhoods, and architecture, a decision that enhanced visual authenticity while also helping actors respond naturally to their surroundings. Since real environments often produce performances that feel more grounded when actors interact with spaces that already carry genuine character and history, the legacy of Man on Fire keeps growing because it appeals to different generations for different reasons. Some viewers admire it purely as an outstanding action film, others appreciate its emotional storytelling, and many film enthusiasts study it for Scott's distinctive visual direction. Very few movies succeed on so many levels at once. It's equally satisfying for audiences seeking entertainment and for those interested in the craft of filmmaking. That broad appeal explains why recommendations for it have stayed so common even decades after release. Looking back now, it's clear the film succeeded because it understood something many action movies forget. Audiences remember emotions far longer than explosions. Spectacular action can grab attention initially, but genuine emotional connection is what creates lasting memories. Through outstanding performances, thoughtful writing, confident direction, memorable cinematography, intelligent editing, and beautifully restrained music, Man on Fire delivers an experience that stays powerful long after the final scene. It's not simply one of the best revenge thrillers of its generation, it's earned a permanent place among the finest character-driven action films ever made. Another reason Man on Fire still feels fresh after so many years is that it never tries to imitate the blockbuster trends that were popular when it came out. In the early 2000s, plenty of action films leaned on exaggerated heroes, non-stop explosions, and fast-paced storytelling built to keep audiences constantly excited. Scott certainly delivers memorable action here, but he approaches the genre from a far more emotional angle. Rather than asking viewers to admire the hero's abilities, he asks them to understand his pain. That difference changes the whole experience and explains why the film still connects with modern audiences who may not even have been born when it first hit theaters. Jalen's screenplay also deserves recognition for how carefully it controls its emotional tone. The writing never tips into sentimentality, yet it never feels cold or detached either. Finding that balance is much harder than it looks. Lean too far toward emotion and the script risks losing dramatic tension. Focus too much on suspense and the audience never becomes emotionally invested. Jalen keeps both elements working together, letting every conversation and important decision feel honest without slowing the film's momentum. Washington once again reminds audiences why he's remained one of Hollywood's most respected actors for decades. His performance works because he fully disappears into John Creasy. At no point does it feel like a movie star trying to impress the audience. Instead, Washington presents a deeply flawed man searching for purpose after years of emotional suffering, avoiding obvious acting choices and trusting subtle details to carry the performance. A brief glance, a quiet pause, a shift in his voice often says more than pages of dialogue ever could. One of the most remarkable qualities of Washington's performance is its emotional consistency. From start to finish, every choice feels driven by the same internal struggles that define Creasy, and even as circumstances grow more dramatic, Washington never abandons the emotional realism established early on. Sustaining that authenticity across such a demanding role takes real discipline, and it's a big part of why so many critics and audiences still rank this performance among the best of his career. Dakota Fanning also deserves continued praise for providing the emotional balance that keeps the film grounded. Her natural screen presence makes every interaction with Washington feel completely believably rather than delivering rehearsed emotional beats. She reacts instinctively, creating scenes that feel spontaneous instead of carefully planned. That authenticity strengthens the audience's emotional connection and keeps the relationship at the film center from ever feeling artificial. It's hard to imagine another young actor bringing the same sincerity to the role. Scott's direction remains one of the film's defining strengths. His visual style is instantly recognizable yet never feels repetitive or self-indulgent, since every creative choice appears rooted in emotion rather than spectacle. Whether through shifting color palettes, energetic editing, unusual camera movement, or layered visual textures, Scott keeps reinforcing the psychological atmosphere around the characters, treating visual style not as the main attraction, but as a tool for deepening the audience's connection to the characters' inner struggles. Paul Cameron's cinematography earns equal recognition for how effectively it complements Scott's vision. His photography captures both the intimacy of personal relationships and the scale of the surrounding world without ever losing focus. Mexico City remains one of the film's strongest visual elements, presented honestly rather than through stereotypy. Busy streets, elegant neighborhoods, crowded public spaces, and quieter residential areas all contribute to an environment that feels authentic and lived in, adding credibility to every emotional interaction. Scott's editing continues to stand out for refusing to follow conventional Hollywood formulas. Rather than sticking to one rhythm throughout the film, it constantly adapts to the character's emotional state. Reflective scenes unfold patiently, while tense moments grow increasingly fragmented and energetic. None of these transitions feel random. They mirror Creasy's psychological journey, resulting in a viewing experience that feels emotionally immersive rather than mechanically paced. Harry Gregson Williams again shows remarkable restraint through the score. Rather than overwhelming emotional scenes with dramatic orchestration, he frequently lets quieter melodies carry the emotional weight of piano themes, subtle strings, carefully placed electronic textures that support the performances without distracting from them. That thoughtful approach makes the score memorable because it serves the story instead of demanding attention. One of the finest examples of music enhancing emotion through subtlety rather than volume. The production design continues contributing to the film's realism in ways audiences may not consciously register. Chris Seegers and his team built environments that feel authentic rather than stylized. Every location contains practical details suggesting real people occupy these spaces outside the events of the story. That attention to everyday realism helps viewers fully accept the world, which in turn makes the performances even more emotionally convincing. Great production design often succeeds by staying invisible, and that's certainly the case here. One fascinating behind-the-scenes detail involves Scott's dedication during post-production. He reportedly spent months refining the film's visual rhythm, working closely with Scalia to make sure every transition reflected the story's emotional progression. Scott believed the film's emotional experience kept evolving in the editing room, and Man on Fire became one of his most carefully crafted projects because of that philosophy. His commitment to refining every visual detail is still evident today. The supporting cast deserves more appreciation than it often gets. Christopher Walken delivers another memorable turn with his trademark calm presence, while Giancarlo Giannini, Mark Anthony, Rhoda Mitchell, Mickey Rourke, and Rachel Ticotin add authenticity to the world around Creasy. None of these performances feel exaggerated or unnecessary. Every supporting actor contributes something meaningful to the emotional atmosphere, helping the story feel populated by believable people rather than generic background characters. Over time, Man on Fire has become one of those rare films whose reputation has kept improving long after its theatrical release. While some critics initially questioned Scott's aggressive visual style, many later revisited the film and recognized how closely those techniques supported its emotional themes. Audiences, meanwhile, embraced the movie almost immediately, helping it build a loyal following through DVD sales, television broadcasts, and eventually streaming. Today, it's widely regarded as one of the strongest collaborations between Tony Scott and Denzel Washington. Ultimately, what keeps Man on Fire relevant is its complete commitment to emotional storytelling. Every department, every performance, and every creative decision serves the same purpose: exploring redemption, purpose, trust, and sacrifice through deeply human characters. The action remains exciting, but it never overshadows the emotion driving it, which is why the film keeps finding new audiences year after year and remains one of the finest examples of an action thriller that's also a genuinely moving character drama. One of the clearest signs that Man on Fire has become a modern classic is how often it comes up in conversations about Denzel Washington's greatest performance. Impressive, given how many iconic roles he's played across courtroom dramas, crime thrillers, historical films, sports stories, and intense character studies. Yet John Creasy continues to stand alongside his most memorable work, not because the role is the loudest or most physically demanding, but because it lets him explore vulnerability, regret, compassion, and determination with real honesty. Those emotional qualities stay with audiences far longer than any action sequence could. Hell Jalen's screenplay deserves renewed appreciation for understanding the importance of emotional patience. Many modern thrillers rush from one dramatic event to the next, rarely giving characters room to breathe. Man on Fire takes the opposite approach, understanding that meaningful relationships develop gradually and that emotional investment can't be forced. By letting conversations, quiet moments, and small personal interactions unfold naturally, the screenplay builds a foundation that supports everything else. Viewers don't just observe the characters, they come to understand them. And that connection is what gives the film its lasting emotional power. Washington's performance grows even more impressive when you consider how little he relies on dialogue to communicate emotion. Some actors depend on long speeches or dramatic confrontations to reveal character. Washington often achieves the same effect through silence. See a thoughtful pause, a restrained smile. The way he lowers his eyes mid-conversation often says more than words could. That level of control reflects an actor who fully trusts both his audience and his material. Someone who never feels the need to exaggerate emotion because he knows authenticity is always more powerful than a performance designed to grab attention. Another remarkable aspect of Washington's work is the consistency of his emotional rhythm. Throughout the film, Creasy evolves naturally without ever feeling like a completely different persona. His growth feels earned because every emotional shift develops gradually through experience. Washington never abandons the quiet sadness that defines the character, even as his confidence slowly returns, and that continuity gives the performance extraordinary credibility, which helps explain why audiences keep responding to it so strongly more than 2 decades later. Dakota Fanning also deserves enormous recognition for helping build one of the most memorable relationships in modern action cinema. She never plays the role with exaggerated innocence or obvious emotional manipulation. Instead, she brings honesty, intelligence, and warmth to every scene. Her natural chemistry with Washington remains one of the film's greatest achievements precisely because it never feels manufactured. Their conversations feel like genuine human interaction rather than scripted emotional beats, which makes the audience's investment feel completely earned. Scott's direction deserves even greater admiration today for how confidently it embraces visual storytelling. Rather than relying solely on dialogue or traditional editing, Scott uses every cinematic tool available to communicate emotion. Lighting, color, camera movement, editing rhythm, subtitles, and visual texture all become extensions of the character's psychological experience. Some critics initially viewed these techniques as excessive, but many later recognized that Scott wasn't experimenting for style alone. Every visual choice supports the film's emotional core, giving Man on Fire an identity unlike almost any other thriller of its time. Paul Cameron's cinematography remains essential to that identity. His photography balances intimacy with scale beautifully, letting viewers appreciate both subtle performances and the larger environment around them. Mexico City continues to feel vibrant, complex, and authentic throughout the film. Rather than reducing the location to a set of familiar images, Cameron presents a living city full of everyday life, cultural richness, and emotional contrast, strengthening the story's realism and giving every scene greater emotional credibility. Scalia's editing deserves another mention for how successfully it translates emotion into rhythm. Rather than sticking to one consistent pace, the cutting constantly responds to the character's psychological state. Reflective moments unfold patiently, while emotional pressure creates increasingly fragmented visual patterns. This approach helps audiences feel what the characters are experiencing rather than simply watching from outside. One of the clearest examples of editing functioning as emotional storytelling rather than purely technical craft. Harry Gregson Williams's score quietly supports that emotional rhythm throughout the film. The music rarely calls attention to itself, yet its influence can be felt in nearly every important scene. Soft orchestral themes, restrained piano melodies, and carefully layered electronic textures create an atmosphere that feels intimate without becoming sentimental. The soundtrack understands that emotional honesty requires subtlety, and that restraint lets the performances stay the primary focus while still being enhanced at every significant moment. The supporting cast deserves another mention, too, since every actor contributes something meaningful to the overall experience. Christopher Walken brings quiet wisdom and calm authority. Giancarlo Giannini adds emotional complexity. Mark Anthony delivers one of his strongest dramatic performances, and Rhoda Mitchell and Mickey Rourke each leave a memorable impression despite relatively limited screen time. These performances strengthen the world around Creasy, making every interaction feel authentic rather than a simple means of advancing the plot. One particularly interesting behind-the-scenes detail is just how much attention Scott devoted to shaping the film's visual identity during post-production. Rather than treating editing and color grading as routine technical steps, he viewed them as essential storytelling tools. So every visual texture, subtitle, transition, and color adjustment was carefully refined to support the emotional atmosphere. This meticulous attention to detail explains why the film feels so visually cohesive despite its highly experimental style. Nothing appears accidental, because every artistic decision serves the same emotional purpose. The film's influence can also be seen in later action thrillers that tried to combine emotional storytelling with visually expressive filmmaking. Few managed the same balance, but Man on Fire demonstrated that audiences were willing to embrace action films built around character development rather than non-stop spectacle. Its success encouraged filmmakers to treat emotional depth as a strength rather than an obstacle, leaving a subtle but lasting mark on the genre. More than 20 years after its release, the film keeps attracting viewers who've heard about it through recommendations rather than advertising, often the strongest sign of lasting quality, since films that survive on word of mouth usually do so because they create genuine emotional connections. People recommend them not because they were commercially successful, but because they remember how the film made them feel. And Man on Fire belongs firmly in that category, continuing to reach new audiences through reputation alone. Ultimately, what makes this film so enduring is its complete confidence in emotional storytelling. It never relies on empty spectacle to generate excitement or artificial sentiment to manufacture emotion. Instead, it trusts strong performances, thoughtful writing, bold direction, beautiful cinematography, intelligent editing, and carefully crafted music to tell a deeply human story. That confidence has let Man on Fire remain one of the most respected revenge thrillers ever made and one of the finest collaborations between Denzel Washington and Tony Scott. Its emotional impact just as powerful today as it was when audiences first experienced it. As the years have passed, Man on Fire has gradually become one of those rare films that seems to improve with age. That's an unusual achievement, since so many action movies are closely tied to the filmmaking trends of their era. Visual effects date, storytelling styles shift, and what once felt exciting can eventually feel ordinary. Man on Fire has avoided that fate because its greatest strengths were never built on temporary trends. They were built on timeless storytelling, believable performances, and genuine emotional depth. Qualities that remain just as effective today as when audiences first saw the film in 2004. One of the screenplay's most impressive accomplishments is its handling of emotional restraint. Hal Jalling never tries to force the audience into feeling a particular way. He lets scenes develop naturally, trusting viewers to respond honestly to the characters and their relationships. That confidence is refreshing. Modern films sometimes lean too heavily on dramatic dialogue or obvious emotional cues, but Man on Fire often says more through silence than many films manage with pages of conversation. That understated writing gives the story lasting emotional credibility. Washington's portrayal of John Creasy continues to stand as one of the defining performances of his career, partly because he never makes the character seem invincible. Creasy is emotionally wounded, physically exhausted, and weighed down by years of regret, and Washington embraces those imperfections instead of hiding them, creating someone entirely believable. Audiences don't admire him because he's perfect, they connect with him because he's deeply human. And that emotional honesty is what turns an already strong screenplay into something genuinely unforgettable. Another aspect of Washington's performance worth celebrating is his extraordinary control over pacing. Every scene unfolds at exactly the emotional speed it needs. He never rushes dramatic moments or exaggerates quiet ones. His timing lets conversations breathe naturally, making interactions feel spontaneous rather than rehearsed. And that patience becomes one of the performance's greatest strengths because it invites audiences to observe rather than simply react. Watching Creasy gradually rediscover purpose feels believable precisely because Washington never forces that transformation. Dakota Fanning's contribution remains equally remarkable. Looking back now, it's striking how naturally she held her own opposite one of Hollywood's greatest actors. Her performance carries warmth without becoming sentimental, intelligence without feeling unrealistic, and emotional honesty without leaning on obvious dramatic techniques. She never appears to be acting for the audience. She simply exists within the story, responding truthfully to every situation. And that authenticity is why her relationship with Creasy remains the emotional center of the entire film. Scott's direction deserves even greater admiration today, representing a filmmaker completely confident in his own artistic voice. Rather than following conventional Hollywood formulas, he embraced a highly personal visual style built around emotion above all else. His use of expressive editing, changing color palettes, layered imagery, and unconventional subtitles wasn't meant simply to look different. Every technique served a psychological atmosphere surrounding the characters. Though these choices divided critics at the time, they've become one of the film's most celebrated qualities in hindsight. Paul Cameron's cinematography remains equally deserving of praise. His work captures Mexico City with a remarkable authenticity, presenting it as a living environment full of complexity rather than a stereotypical backdrop for action. The city's architecture, neighborhoods, traffic, public spaces, and daily life all contribute to a world that feels completely believable, and Cameron shows real sensitivity during quieter emotional scenes, using lighting and composition to support performances without drawing unnecessary attention to the camera itself. That balance between visual style and emotional realism remains one of the film's greatest technical achievements. Editor Pietro Scalia also deserves enormous credit, since his work fundamentally shapes the film's emotional rhythm. Rather than following predictable editing patterns, Scalia constantly adjusts pace according to the character's psychological state. Reflective moments unfold patiently, while periods of emotional tension grow increasingly fragmented through rapid visual transitions. This approach creates an immersive experience where viewers don't just observe the story, they emotionally experience it alongside the characters. Few editors manage to make pacing feel so deeply connected to emotion. Harry Gregson Williams once again demonstrates exceptional restraint through his score. Instead of constantly cueing the audience on when to feel something, he quietly supports the performances with understated melodies and subtle orchestral textures. The soundtrack never overwhelms the story because it understands its role perfectly at enhancing emotion that's already present in the performances rather than trying to manufacture it. That discipline keeps the score effective even after multiple viewings and contributes greatly to the film's lasting emotional impact. The production design keeps reinforcing realism through countless small details audiences may barely notice consciously. Every environment feels lived in, practical, and authentic. Homes reflect the personalities of their occupants, public spaces retain natural imperfections, and workplaces feel genuinely functional. These design choices quietly strengthen audience immersion because nothing feels artificially constructed for cinematic effect. Another example of how every department consistently prioritized authenticity over spectacle. One particularly fascinating behind-the-scenes fact involves the collaboration between Scott and his technical team during post-production. Scott reportedly spent extensive time perfecting color timing, visual textures, subtitle placement, and editing rhythm until every scene reflected the emotional atmosphere he envisioned. This obsessive attention to detail explains why Man on Fire feels so visually unified despite its experimental style. Every artistic decision contributes to the same emotional experience, a level of consistency rarely achieved in large-scale studio productions. The film's reputation has also benefited enormously from shifting critical opinion. Reviews at release were somewhat mixed on Scott's visual techniques, but many later reassessments praised exactly those same qualities. Critics came to recognize that the aggressive editing, layered imagery, and unusual cinematography weren't distractions, but deliberate storytelling tools designed to place audiences inside Creasy's emotional perspective. That shift in critical opinion has helped cement Man on Fire as one of Scott's most respected directorial achievements. Perhaps the strongest evidence of the film's lasting success is how often it's recommended by people who genuinely love cinema. Recommendations rooted in personal enthusiasm tend to have far longer lives than marketing campaigns or short-term box office success. People keep introducing friends and family to Man on Fire because they know it offers something memorable beyond action alone. The emotional journey, unforgettable performances, distinctive direction, and technical craftsmanship combine to make the film feel just as rewarding on a fifth viewing as it does on the first. Looking back after more than 2 decades, it's hard to imagine the revenge thriller genre without Man on Fire occupying such an important place in it. The film proved that emotionally driven storytelling could exist alongside stylish action without sacrificing either element. It challenged expectations, trusted its audience, and delivered an experience built on authenticity rather than spectacle. That's why it continues to stand as one of the finest action dramas of the modern era and remains a benchmark for filmmakers hoping to combine technical ambition with genuine emotional depth. When people look back at Man on Fire, they usually think of Denzel Washington's incredible performance first. But the longer you sit with the film, the clearer it becomes that its success came from every department working toward the same goal, and no single element carries the whole thing. The screenplay provides the emotional depth, the direction builds a unique visual identity, the cinematography creates atmosphere, the editing shapes emotional rhythm, the music strengthens every important moment, and the cast brings complete honesty to every scene.